This is section 6 of our Unit 8 notes. Today we're going to be talking about biodiversity. So there are different levels of biodiversity, including genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. Genetic diversity arises from multiple processes listed here, and as we know, high genetic diversity allows populations to respond to a changing environment. It keeps those populations going over time. Even artificial selection can make more variety. For example, the ancestred wild mustard plant has been artificially selected to make each one of these other crops, depending on what traits were selected for in the wild mustard. We also have species diversity within biodiversity, which is how many different types of species are in a particular area. So a number of factors can affect this, including habitat size, the diversity of the habitats available, any keystone species that exist, and then species evenness and richness, and then succession. So habitat diversity, for example, can definitely determine species richness. So think of a large island. Larger islands have more distinct habitats, but now we want to focus on the diversity of niches within a given habitat. So if you think about situations of birds that live in habitats containing only short plants, like grasses and flowers, versus habitats that contain short plants and shrubs, and then habitats that contain short plants, shrubs, and then trees. So as we move across this gradient, there are many more ways for bird species to make a living when there is a greater diversity of foliage heights to live in. So the more diversity within the habitat, the more species can survive in that habitat. The presence of a keystone species. Keystone species are essential for other species to thrive in their environment. So if that keystone species is available, then we could see a lot of other species around. But if that keystone species is not there, you could also see an absence of many other species. So here's an example here of along the coast of Washington State. We find a community of species that live in the intertidal range of the shoreline, which is the rocky shoreline that's exposed during low tide, but it's submerged in the ocean during high tide. Here we could find about 20 species, including sea stars, mussels, limpets, barnacles, and several species of attached algae. However, other coastal areas are dominated by mussels with hardly any other species present. So it's because of the predatory sea star that is a keystone species. And the sea star, by removing it, had a large effect within just a couple of years, reducing species diversity from about 18 species down to just 1. So the one remaining species was the mussel. So when you think about when you go to like our Atlantic beaches, New Jersey, Ocean City, Maryland, you would see a large quantity of mussels on the beach. Well, the reason that there are so many mussels is because mussels are excellent competitors for rock space, and they quickly crowd out all other species. So the sea star likes to eat mussels. So if there's an area that doesn't have the sea star and it's not eating the mussels, well, then the mussels are able to outcompete a lot of the other species. So we don't see a lot of that a lot of different species on like our intertidal zones on our local beaches. And when you're talking about biodiversity can have substantial effects on an ecosystem. So the amount of biodiversity can influence organization, productivity, and then resistance and resilience. So if you're talking about organization, a very species-poor ecosystem may only contain producers. As species increase, the ecosystem can include primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. The organization of an ecosystem can be strongly impacted when a keystone species is removed from an ecosystem. So another example of this is sea otters. So sea otters eat sea urchins, and urchins eat kelp. Okay, and that kelp grows very tall and is a habitat for many fish. So obviously we would like the sea otters to eat the sea urchins, keep them in check, so the kelp can grow and be that habitat for those fish. You get rid of the sea otters, then the sea urchins are eating all the kelp, and that habitat isn't available for many other species of fish. Species diversity also affects ecosystem productivity, which is the amount of biomass accumulated by all species of producers in a year. So a given ecosystem can vary widely on how many species of producers are present, from just a few to hundreds. So as a result, we can ask whether having more species allows ecosystems to produce the same amount or a higher amount of total producer biomass compared to having fewer species in a given area. So here there was an experiment conducted, which you can read about. So as the number of species increases, we increase the diversity of niches that are present. So given the diversity of niches among producer species, an increase in the number of species allows a more complete use of the available sunlight, water, and soil nutrients. This translates into an increase in the productivity of the ecosystem compared to ecosystems with fewer species of producers. Here is another example on this slide with mutualistic fungi, so you could read about that. But essentially, the more species of soil fungi that were present, the more the plants were able to grow and the more productive the ecosystem becomes. So that brings us to resistance and resilience. So biodiversity can affect the stability of ecosystems in terms of resistance, which is the ecosystem's ability to not be impacted by an environmental disturbance, whereas resilience is the ecosystem's ability to bounce back from an environmental disturbance. So if we're talking about the fields in Minnesota from the previous slide, researchers manipulated the diversity of plant species in different plots containing 1, 2, 4, 8, or 16 species of plants. The researchers tracked the abundance of the plants and more than 700 species of insects for 11 years. So that's a long time. And they did this to determine how seasonal and annual variation in environmental disturbances, such as drought, affected the stability of the ecosystem. In both these figures, we see that increases in plant species richness caused an increase in the stability of the herbivores that depend on these plants and the predators and parasitoids that depend on the herbivores. Biodiversity also benefits humans. So there's an economic value to biodiversity. So natural products that humans use, including lumber, fur, meat, crops, medications. Not lumber, fur, lumber, fur. We could use biodiversity to help control floods, filtering water, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, recreational activities, hiking, fishing, bird watching, critical service of pollinating wild and domesticated plants. There's also an intrinsic value. For example, the effort to bring back the bald eagle from the brink of extinction was motivated not by economics, but by the sense of moral obligation, since it is the national bird of the United States. We then see latitude diversity patterns. So you'll see one of the most striking patterns of species diversity is that species richness is highest near the equator and lowest near the poles. So if you would walk through a forest in the eastern United States, you might see 10 to 20 different species of trees. However, if you took a similar walk in the tropical rainforest, you would see 300 to 400 different species of trees. A similar pattern of species richness can be found in the distribution of animal species. So when we understand these patterns of diversity, it informs us about where most species have evolved, where most species might be at risk of human impacts, and even where we are most likely to find new pharmaceutical drugs from nature. So scientists think that the reason for this pattern is linked to environmental conditions, and that tropical locations are much older and therefore contain species that have evolved and diversified over tens of millions of years. Habitats closer to the poles have experienced instances of glaciers moving southward, which would have eliminated species, and regions closer to the poles have had less time for the evolution of new species. So then we have biodiversity hotspots. So knowing these patterns of latitudinal species diversity, we can identify places that have a lot of species, including areas of the tropics and islands that have evolved endemic species. And as we've discussed, endemic species are species that are found nowhere else on the planet. As human activities continue to negatively impact the population of many species, an important question is how we best conserve biodiversity to prevent extinction. So in response to this, biologists have developed a method of prioritizing conservation efforts because there's not a lot of money for this. So we have to prioritize where this money is going to go. So they've created biodiversity hotspots, which are areas with at least 1,500 endemic plant species and experiencing at least 70% of vegetation removal as a result of human activities. So these are the areas with a large number of species that face a large threat. So there's about 36 hotspots around the world, and plant species are used to define these hotspots. So here they are. And that is it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great rest of your day.